Greetings, everybody. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I'm so delighted to see you all, and I'm equally delighted, even more delighted, to welcome back to Brown, her alma mater, President and Professor Eun Mee Kim, the 17th president of Ewha Womans University in the Republic of Korea. Before I speak about President Kim and her biography, I'd just like to say a word, if you don't mind, about the Lee Gregorian Distinguished Lecture. This event honors Chung-Wook Lee, the founder and former president of the University of Suwon in the Republic of Korea, as well as the late Vartan Gregorian, who prior to his passing last year was president emeritus of Brown University and also president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The lectureship symbolizes really the decades of friendship between the two presidents, but also it celebrates the relationship between two universities, a relationship that was established formally in 1992. The lectureship aims to increase understanding about global issues and problems, particularly those affecting Asia and the United States. And again, there's nobody better suited to deliver this distinguished lecture than President Eun Mee Kim, who will be speaking today on the topic of sustainable development in the era of COVID and digital transformation. In addition to being the 17th president of Ewha Women's College, President Kim is professor in the Graduate School of International Studies, director of the Ewha Global Health Institute for Girls and Women, former dean of the Graduate School, former dean of the Graduate School of International Studies, and former director of the Institute for Development and Human Security at Ewha Womans University. President Kim was appointed by the UN Secretary General in December of 2016 to serve as one of 15 members of the independent group of scientists who worked on the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report, which is an extraordinary undertaking that was completed in 2019. President Kim had served previously as president of the Korea Association of International Development and Cooperation. That was in 2011 and 2012. And she also served on the Committee for International Development Cooperation under the Prime Minister's Office, the Policy Advisory Committee for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family. On top of all of those administrative achievements and public service achievements, President Kim was and continues to be a distinguished scholar, of course. In 2013, she received the first research grant to a university in South Korea from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for her research on advocacy for Korean engagement in global health and development. In 2016 and again in 2019, she received a research grant from the Gates Foundation for her work on Korea's global health strategy. And Professor Kim just presented me with her most recent book along with Barbara Stallings. It's extraordinary that you're able to continue your scholarship at that level in addition to all the other things that you're doing so successfully. I just want to mention that President Kim earned her BA in sociology from Ewha Women's College and her MA and PhD in sociology from right here at Brown University. With that, again, I want to warmly welcome you and turn the floor over to you, Professor Kim. Welcome back to Brown.
Thank you very much for that very oops, I think I did something to this. Okay, whoops. What do I do?
We can get a little bit of tech help.
Okay. 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 Well, thank you very much. That was entirely too generous. I'm very honored to be back at Brown. It's a pleasure and honor whenever I'm invited to give talks, but when it's your alma mater and with such a distinguished lectureship, it's a double honor. Today, I would like to talk about sustainable development in the era of the digital transformation, or the fourth industrialization, which is how it is known in Korea, and the pandemic. And I want us to because this is a Watson Institute, I wanted you and me to think about the global north vis-a-vis the global south, and who are winning out and who are losing out in the pandemic. So here goes. And hopefully I'll have some time at the end, but if you have like burning questions that you must ask now, and otherwise you'll forget, please stop me and I'll be happy to respond to questions. So today I'm going to talk about the introduction, the digital transformation, and the concerns that I have in terms of the digital divide, and then doubling that to the gender divide, what the pandemic has done for this, and going back to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, in which I worked on the Global Sustainable Development Report, which was supposed to be a critical assessment of UN's work. So here goes. So this is what I was thinking. The digital transformation, or the fourth industrial revolution, was affecting the world in very, very important ways. And then on my other side of the work, I work on sustainable development goals out of the UN and try to understand what we ought to do for this world to sustain itself beyond 2030. So sustainable development goals gave us some ingredients to think about what we should be doing as people with the environment in the face of climate change and all these other transformative changes around the world. And then the pandemic hit in early 2020, and everything got put on a spin. And I think many of the things that were already predicted with the digital transformation, or the fourth industrial revolution, just became explosive overnight. Whether you were prepared or not, we had to do online teaching. And this was, very chaotic for the students, I'm sure. The professors, who are much older than you, were having a hard time getting ready for these new classes. So the digital transformation, as you know, is affecting all aspects of our life, production, work, to governance, and so on. Digital development from 2007 to 2013, R&D expenditure around the world was increasing over 30%. Researchers working on digital issues, digital topics, 21%. Scientific publications on this topic was already increasing, and this is the figures from 2013. So if you look at the internet activities, what I was seeing as someone who's been studying development or lack thereof in the global south, I was very concerned about the widening digital gap. If you can read the fine print with me, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, they produced the Digital Economy Report in 2021. This slide shows that in banking and finance, information education, governmental services, trade and industry, and health, there were already showing signs of the digital gap between the global north and the global south. So these were affecting the many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that I listed up there. In terms of workers, we're getting these stories that about 2/3 of the jobs are susceptible to automation, which means that we will be losing jobs. Premature deindustrialization. It means that countries, developing countries in particular, that rely heavily on traditional technologies will completely lose out. They won't have the time to progress to the next level of development and industrialization. They will simply lag behind terribly qualitatively in this digital transformation. So the less skilled workers who are paid less in the global south are the most vulnerable vis-a-vis the more skilled workers in the global south, but also less skilled workers in the global north. So I want you to think about who are really losing out the most in this game. So the UN and others have been working on what we call the digital divide, inequality in access, capacity to work with new digital technologies, these were transforming into broader set of inequality. It wasn't just the digital divide, but it was affecting many arenas of our lives. Vulnerable populations would be dependent on technology developed by others, unable to change technologies, and I will talk about the gender divide in all of this later on. Digital divide making it very difficult for the Sustainable Development Goals to be reached by 2030, and I will talk about the Sustainable Development Goals in a few minutes. Now, Ed mentioned, if I can, mentioned that I worked on the Global Sustainable Development Report 2019. What the mandate was from the United Nations member states is during the Millennium Development Goals of 2001 to 2015, the UN were producing annual reports of what they were doing, how the MDGs were being achieved around the world. But they were concerned that UN was, if I can make this analogy, the students are writing their evaluation scores, and sometimes we don't always trust those who are taking the test to be also grading your own exams. That's not happening at Brown, of course. But the UN member states said, we want an independent group assessing how we're doing with Sustainable Development Goals. That's why the 15 Independent Group of Scientists, or IGS, we were born. We didn't do original analysis. What we did is meta-analysis, looking at all the reports and reviews that came out on the achievement of SDGs to see, or to understand what around the world, how countries were faring in terms of achieving the SDG goals. We looked at, the room, probably enough papers and books to fill this room. The most striking map that I saw in this, when we were working on this, is this R&D map. What does this tell you? The UN, we worked with 6 UN agencies to help write this report. They felt this map was so sensitive. We first had the country names on the map. They felt it was so sensitive that they first told me we couldn't have it in our report. But we insisted because many of the independent group of scientists that worked on the report felt it was critical to let people know that there was this big gap in R&D and in research and development. So finally we compromised and said you can remove the names of the countries, but they allowed us to include this in our report. The most stark thing is all the circles are concentrated in what we call the global north. Furthermore, not only they're many, but they're bigger, meaning the size of R&D investment, but also it's primarily in red. Red indicated private sector investment. On the other end, the blue meant more public sector investments in R&D. I know big companies, corporations do very good research, but the bulk of their research is geared toward making their products better, making their consumer liaison better, rather than global public goods like gender equality. What about climate change? Those are not at the top of their research agenda, unfortunately. So this map was the most telling map, and I go back to this map trying to understand what can we do to reverse this gap? What must be done? And I became a big champion of supporting higher education in the Global South. In the Global North, like great universities like Brown, we give scholarships for students from all over the world to come to Brown. But at the end, they don't have places to go back in their home countries because they're not universities or places where they can work. Furthermore, if you want your country to be sustainable with economic development or social development or whatnot, you really can't do it with just primary or secondary education. You need people with tertiary education. So unless you invest in higher education developing countries, I'm really afraid that sustainable development won't be had in developing countries. So this R&D divide was a very critical map that sort of told me also that this was intertwined with higher education or lack thereof in the developing countries. Oops. And then when I was looking at the digital divide, another sort of point of division came in the gender divide, and how I would talk about later how this have been exacerbated during the COVID-19. In terms of not only were we seeing the divide between the developed countries and developing countries, but in each of these countries, the gender divide was getting critical, especially in the fourth industrial revolution. In the digital transformation, the women were not going to the fields that were seen as critical in advancing in the digital transformation age. Distribution of female students enrolled in higher education by field of study, world average. Low share of women in STEM and ICT, only 3%. Science, math, and statistics, 5%. Engineering, manufacturing, construction, 8%. So maybe the situation, I think the situation is much better, equitable here in the United States, but still there is already showing an intensification of the gender gap in these very critical fields in the digital transformation era. How it has impacted the work and income and poverty. Gender share of the STEM R&D workforce is only about 20.7%. Income gap has grown. So this has contributed to women in poverty in numbers that is beginning to show. This incident happened in Korea and received a lot of attention. This is the AI-driven chatbot called Ewha. She was introduced in 2021 after months of work. The AI-driven conversation chatbot was introduced and was so successful. They got 800,000 users in just 3 weeks. But the controversy was that it took a persona of a 20-year-old female college student, and they used data mined from romantic apps. So without any filtering, without any idea of gender sensitivity, sexual harassment and other forms of hate speech were found in the Ewha chatbot. So it became a huge controversy, but at the end, the developer was fined not for sexual harassment or other charges, but for protection of personal information, because they used 9.4 billion chats by 600,000 people without removing their personal identification. So it was shut down. It did reopen with a Ewha 2.0, which I haven't really looked at. But this was my worst nightmare come true. I was convinced somehow, looking at the gender divide, that somehow, somewhere, AI with gender insensitivity, because in Korea right now, Korea is ranked 102nd in the Global Gender Gap Report. So we know we're not doing too well in terms of gender equality. So the AI mining what it is, learning from what the society is as now, and simply reproducing. So what's the problem? Because it's a highly insensitive to gender issues. It exacerbates current inequalities and solidifies it to the extent that it's very difficult to change. Now, if there was a bad law, we can go to the National Assembly, or we can use other means to protest the bad laws, which Ewha has done for many years, changing our family laws and so on. But this is very difficult. When it's embedded in a AI algorithm, I don't even know where to begin. I just know I have this inkling that this is very unequal and there's injustice, but how do I approach it? How do I make the developer change that? I just find it mind-boggling. I don't know where to begin. So the fact that it's embedded in this AI-driven chatbot was my worst nightmare. And it made me think about how AI may exacerbate or solidify the current inequalities without thinking about a future that would be better for all. Can we think about equality, peace, sustainable development, better climate change mitigation? Those won't be had if we simply replicate what is today without hopes of improving. So this is what I want to do with our AI research at Ewha. The pandemic, what did the pandemic do in all of this? My RA, Nancy, said, is it an accelerator or aggravator? I thought it was a great title. Accelerator for digital transformation or aggravator for inequality. I'm sure it's yes to both names. Accelerator for digital transformation in particular because, as I said, overnight in 2020 spring semester, we all had to learn, Zoom classes. We all had to learn to use online hybrid teaching, even if we weren't trained or thought it was a useful mechanism. So there are many ways in which the digital transformation has been accelerated thanks to or because of COVID. But on the other hand, I'm looking at very concerned about inequalities, various forms of inequalities that have been exacerbated or widened during the pandemic. This simply shows the use of internet, customer interactions that are digital has really gone up. But by 2021, internet connectivity became less affordable to people who live in developing countries. So we're starting to see the widening gap with COVID exacerbating the current inequalities that we're already starting to show with the digital transformation. Now, I wanted to turn to extreme poverty. This shows that from 2020 to 2021 by Inca Group and region, we saw extreme poverty rise for the first time since the 1990s. With the UN Millennium Development Goals, we worked so hard around the world to have the extreme poverty, and we were successful by 2015. But for the first time, we're seeing worsening of extreme poverty that we hadn't seen for nearly 20 years. Recovery from 2021 is uneven. Richer countries are decreasing poverty at the same or better rates than pre-COVID, but poor countries are increasing poverty at higher rates than pre-COVID. So we're already seeing this divide in poverty rates around the world. How many of you heard the term universal health coverage, UHC? You've heard about it? Of those you who already heard about it, have you heard about UHC in the COVID pandemic, since the pandemic hit? Honestly, no one? I didn't hear it. And I just was, I was impressed with the universal health coverage and what it wanted to do. But during the pandemic and still now, we don't even hear the word UHC. I think everybody forgot what UHC stood for. It meant that all people and communities receive the health services they need without suffering financial hardships. So it was about cost, about accessibility, and institutional support to make sure that you have access to health services. In terms of vaccine access, high-income countries, 1 in 1 people, or about 68%. Low-income countries, about less than 12%. And this is from February 2022, so it's not very long time ago. So the stark difference is quite palpable. vaccine affordability, the same story. So what we were aspiring for in terms of universal health coverage has all but lost during the pandemic. I go back to the gender issue because in some ways the pandemic has worsened the gender divide in poverty. COVID-19 will contribute to the worsening of gender poverty gaps, and you can see the fine print. And this is from UN Women. Gender divide in terms of women at work. COVID-19 multiplied the workload at home and women, and women are paying the price. I thought maybe this was only the case in countries like Korea, where women often play the role of caring for the household and the children, but sadly, this was true across the world. Let me see if I have that here. I didn't include that. I think I had 2 minutes, so I decided not to include that slide. Elsevier is a major publishing warehouse, and they do a lot of handle academic journals. So Elsevier, with their data, and a lot of scholars worked on it, found that it was statistically significant around the world that women scholars, academics, were submitting less journal articles to journals for publication. So there are fewer articles by women scientists across the fields to be reviewed by academic journals. Now, what does that mean? It means maybe for the 2.5 or 3 years, women scientists around the world were not publishing their work, but it means that their promotion will be delayed. If you have a lack in your publication record for 3 years, that has a long-lasting impact. Your promotion would be under balance, and whatever gains the women academics have made over the years could be lost. And I was just blown away that this was not isolated phenomenon in several countries, but across the world it was statistically significant. So I worry about the long-term impact this will have on women academics, and if you translate this to other fields, if I have the data, I'm sure the story would not be that different, unfortunately. So I go back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. No one is actually talking about Sustainable Development Goals these days, and it was already finished in 2015 and took effect in 2016. But I think going back to the Sustainable Development Goals can tell us some where we ought to go, maybe some solutions. I think this audience knows the difference between the MDGs or SDGs, but I did a quick comparison. The Millennium Development Goals. By the way, this is the first time that UN went serious about poverty issues. Before, UN and continues to be much more focused on peace and security. They're less interested in developmental poverty issues. But in 2001, in the new millennium, for the first time, they saw extreme poverty as a real problem and could affect security relations. So then they decided to work on poverty alleviation as their primary goal. The Millennium Development Goals, poverty reduction, they wanted to see extreme poverty, which at the time when MDGs were announced, $1 a day for spending. It's not $1 a day for production because it's really hard to compare that, but they thought $1 a day in terms of consumption power. And they changed that with inflation, and I think it's like 1.90. What they were trying to do is at least we should try to reduce extreme poverty around the world so people can have a decent living. Many of the goals, the 8 goals in the Millennium Development Goals, were what we call social development goals. It was about primary education, making secondary education available, maternal and child health improvements, because these were seen as global problem areas for developing countries. And the solution was for developed countries to provide assistance through foreign aid, ODA, and other means of support to developing countries. So the focus was on developing countries, global north, providing for the global south. In the 15 years that this was going on, countries in the global north, there were some buy-in was not easy because it was only for developing countries, nothing for the developed countries. But then, like in the United States and countries like South Korea as well, there are pockets of poverty. There are areas in which poverty is still a problem. There are inequalities, so some groups are more susceptible to poverty. So it was clear that if we were trying to have a global goal, that it had to embrace the problems of the global north as well. And furthermore, the MDGs focus on providing for compulsory education, health care, and so on. But if you look at the MDG goals, it's really interesting. You want to educate the person, want the person to be healthy, but then no way do we talk about the person should have a job, or the person should have an income-generating opportunity. So in the Sustainable Development Goals, economic development was also seen as a very important separate goal. And then the big tension between, if you want to have economic growth, it often meant that the environment would suffer in terms of natural resource depletion, pollution, ecological footprint, where we produce too much waste that could not be sustained. So in the Sustainable Development Goals, it was a three-pillar development: economic, social, and environmentally sustainable. And the focus was not just on developing countries, but the whole world, the global north on their own, global north when they're supporting the global south countries, and also for the environment. So one of the nicknames of Sustainable Development Goals was Leave No One Behind, but also Save the Earth, because we had to live there. We wanted our children and next generations to have the earth. So these are the 17 goals. This is to transform our world. So when I talk about the digital transformation, this talks about the fourth industrial revolution transforming our lives, and we sort of become a subject of this transformation. But in the SDGs, we're trying to take back ownership. We're trying to make sure that the world becomes a more hospitable place for everyone, and including the environment. So I think this still holds promise to provide solutions, but sadly, no one is talking about SDGs anymore. Along with the map of the world with the R&D gap, this is our own configuration of how to understand Sustainable Development Goals, because we already had 17 goals, and the big mandate about the 17 goals is we're not allowed to cherry pick. We have to try to attain all 17 goals together. They're not to be divisive. They're to be one, united, and integrated. But how to translate that at the policy level? How do you really use that to implement in your country? So the 15 of us sat down and worked on this entry points of transformation. This is fine print that you can't really see, but 6 systems. So we introduced the systems approach. So for example, the easiest for me was to understand the food system. So if you look at the food system, you can go from SDG goal number 1, reduce poverty, to SDG 3 with women. Women and men have different roles in the production scheme, but then it's also related to consumption and to cities and to waste management. So we introduced a systems approach to allow governments and entities to use the SDGs in a more informed way. And the 6 systems were energy systems, food systems, human well-being, urban and peri-urban development, and so on. And the 4 levers were introduced that could facilitate the achievement of SDGs. That was through governance, that was through economy and finance, individual collective action, and science and technology. So in our work, we focus on how the digital transformation can work for sustainable development, not the other way around. And this is the cover of our report. It's a big report. So from all of these work and discussions that we're having, looking back at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's about reducing the digital divide. In particular, we felt it was really important to have disaggregated data to measure inequalities. But how can you do that? I mean, in the United States, we have data coming out of our ears, so we don't have to worry about not having data. But if you're sitting in Fiji or in Zimbabwe or Pakistan, you worry about where you can get good, credible data, because if you don't have data, you can't get support. United Nations is not going to come, or USAID can't come with support if you say, we need help. But how much? Where's the evidence? So having this disaggregated data to measure inequality is the first step. And you can't do it with scientists just flying in for a week. You need to have local capabilities. That's why I became a big champion of higher education in developing countries. This means that you have to have increased and enhanced SDI-focused higher education, R&D. Remember the digital divide in R&D expenditure? So you want more R&D expenditure, but in order to do that, to use that, you need people who are educated. Governance, and finally, for those of you who are at WASN, official development assistance or foreign aid, and technology transfer and fair intellectual property regime to help developing countries, to help the global south with overcoming the digital divide. And of course, it's reducing the gender gap, and gender gap also requires gender disaggregated data. You can't do it if you have data that cannot support to show there are real inequalities. So gender disaggregated data for reducing the gender gap. In our report, we talk about investing in earlier and greater women's enrollment in STEM fields, increase female researchers, increase women in issues, research on issues, prioritize women, and reduce the burden of unpaid domestic and care work for women. And finally, we talk about empowering women's groups and other civil society groups to help sustain this movement. And this is more facts about official development assistance. It's been mixed since the COVID. Some countries have actually increased their commitment during COVID, many have decreased. Overall increase is not proportional to the need that we have seen created by COVID-19 in the global south. So my conclusion is, leave no one behind is the catchphrase of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, along with Save Our Earth, but leave no one behind is the more prominent, well-known. So I would say leave no one behind in the COVID-19 response. Bridging the digital gap and working on the gender divide, I think, is critical. So just a plug-in for what we're doing at Ewha in terms of digital transformation and how I'm working on to reducing the gender gap. My work at the UN, I was looking at developing countries and how we were seeing this digital divide and gender divide in digital education and so on. In Korea is no exception, unfortunately. So young female students have a hard time going into STEM fields. They feel they're not welcome. They don't see the value of going into the STEM field. So I want to first be very mindful of the gender gap in digital transformation. I want to make sure our students have AI literacy and digital literacy. And that comes from the work that I did with developing countries, but even in Korea, we saw that that could happen. So we have already created a new AI major this year. Next year, it's going to go into a College of AI. But in the College of AI, there are 3 pillars of AI research and education that I would like to do. First is like when we talk about AI, it's the AI core technology done in engineering schools, so AI core. The second pillar that most universities invest in is the AI conversions and application. Even if I don't know how to make a computer, I have to use a computer. I have to use these programs. So AI is, it looks like the future. And even if you're not inventing AI or working on AI algorithms, you would have to incorporate AI and big data in your research. So, so the second pillar is the AI application conversions. But finally, there are some programs in the US and Europe that have developed the third pillar, which is AI and social ethics. For me, AI and gender is so critical. And as I showed you, my worst nightmare with Iruda. So the third pillar at Ewha's AI research and education is about gender sensitivity, about inequalities that AI may exacerbate. So we're going to do a lot of research to demonstrate where the gaps are happening, what we ought to do, and transform our education so that the engineering students who are learning how to work on the AI core algorithms would have sensitivity for a better future. And how we define better future, how we define or work on inequality is a big question. So, and we need people from philosophy, from linguistics, from sociology, all the disciplines to come together to talk about how AI will affect people and how we may use AI for a better future. So the third pillar is going to be very important for Ewha. We also started a graduate school of data science, and these are all based on a very interdisciplinary research and education, because the digital transformation is not just going to be about AI and data science, but how we use it, how we use it for improving all of our lives. Ewha has done a lot for global South and sustainable development in our own way, because Ewha was founded by American missionaries from this country a long time ago, 136 years ago. So we feel a debt of gratitude to others who came who did not know Korea. So we feel it's in our genes to try to help women from the global South who still need support. We try to do research collaboration, and we try to have more funding for students coming from developing countries. So finally, this is my last slide. So I want us to think about the fallout from the digital transformation, the pandemic. I want you to think about the global South and perhaps women. And I think we do need very concerted efforts to stop and reverse the effects of the digital transformation and the pandemic from becoming entrenched inequalities. That's what really worries me, that, you know, the pandemic is a short, in our long course of life, maybe a short term, a 3-year blip in our history. But unfortunately, this may have long-term consequences that will be very difficult. It's not the inequalities that have been widened will not just go away when the pandemic is over, unfortunately. So I worry about how we can work hard to make sure that the inequalities that have been widened during the pandemic will not become entrenched inequalities that will set us back. I want us to use the transformative power of the digital transformation to meet the needs of people and sustainable development. And unfortunately, we don't see much of this, but the global governance is needed. United Nations, WHO, you name it, they're not playing their role in this day and age. So global governance, I think, is really critical in this period. Finally, global public goods are needed to empower the most vulnerable, not just to provide protection when the protection is needed, but empowering them so they can then become the agents of change. So go back to leave no one behind. That's it. Thank you. So this is Ewha's underground campus. It's underground, but it's exposed. So come see it for yourselves. Thank you.
President Kim, would you like to take questions? I can field the questions if you'd like. How would you like to proceed?
Whatever. Why don't you come and join
Okay,
me?
yeah, and why don't we sit at the table?
Yeah.
That way you don't have to stand.
Okay.
Please. Well, again, President Kim, thank you for that really outstanding talk, a very thought-provoking talk. Let me open it up to the audience, and do we have any questions? I can begin with one. So let me take the prerogative and begin with one, but please, I welcome your questions. So, Professor Kim, President Kim, you talked about the Sustainable Development Goals in a very persuasive way, and also talked about, at the end, with some of the absence of governance at a global level. And I guess my question for you is, what are the mechanisms by which the Sustainable Development Goals can actually motivate behavior and change? So by what mechanisms? Is it going to be the UN doing it? Is it the private sector that can come in? Who's really the target audience for the goals?
That's a great question. And in my the slide that had the transformative system analysis, there are the 4 levers, and we wanted to show that it's going to be done by collective action and individual action together. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes when we talk about global governance at the UN and so on, we talk about, United Nations doing the whole thing or governments, but we felt that it was really critical to look at how people, one person at a time, could make a difference. And we're trying to harness how not just the big government, international organizations, but individuals also must change. So the answer is all of the above. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to make sure that the individual action is not lost. When we often talk about these big issues in collective action, we forget the individual. But the individual has to make a change in his or her life choices, in what to consume, how to consume, whether to throw away, two half of what you produce to eat in one country, and the other part of the world suffers from lack of food. So, yeah. Yeah,
I see. Interesting. Yes, there's a question in the back.
안녕하세요, 총장님. My name is Ji-hoon. I'm a senior studying culture anthropology here at Brown, and I'm also from Korea. So, thank you for visiting Brown. I guess as you have a very long experience, professionally and also in college, as a Korean woman. So what are some differences in gender stereotypes that you have recognized, and when you entered academia in 80s, 90s, and then kind of the gender stereotypes embedded in, for example, the Iruda, AI. So how has gender disparity changed or stayed the same throughout, in your opinion, throughout the time period you were in academia?
Thank you for the question. It's not an easy question to answer because I lived about half of my life in the U.S. Now I think 1/3 in the U.S. and 2/3 in Korea. When I came to Brown to study sociology, I thought after I get my PhD, I'm going to return back to Korea. That was my plan. But because of economic hardship, I felt that I had to finish, ASAP. When my scholarship ran out, that meant that's when I had to graduate. It's not like I work on my dissertation and wait until it comes to this big, nice dissertation filled with great answers. No, I had to finish it when my scholarship ran out. So when my scholarship ran out, I had to go on the job market, but my friends in Korea said, "Oh, you have 3 things going against you." I said, "What are they? Please enlighten me." And they're, one, you're a woman, so no way university will look at your CV. And this was 1986. And then second, your ABD, nobody's going to look at ABD. This is all by dissertation. So this is right before you have your degree in hand. So they won't trust you because you don't really have a degree. And third, you're too young. And I said, when did youth ever become such a hindrance? But that was then. So I said, okay, so I won't look for a job in Korea, and I looked for a job in the United States. And I did get a job, a tenure-track job at University of Southern California, so not bad. So the point is, it wasn't very hospitable, even in academic careers, which we think is much better than other fields of professions or life. Still, that was very much an obstacle. And then when I worked as a sociologist, as a professor here in the United States, I could continue my work on third world development. I could continue to work on my the research on political economy, and was fine. But I was surprised that I was, in spite of the fact that my graduate student cohort around that time were all very interested in third world development. Many of us were using dependency theory. So when I go to these academic conferences, I was about the only woman from Korea or Asia, when I knew for sure there were many more when they were studying. Many of them who went back to Korea were out of choice or out of pressure, had to change fields to more fields that are more friendly to women, and very few remained in political economy. So even for academics, that gender stereotyping appeared to be still very true. So now I think in Korea, in professional circles, it has definitely improved. So you're not, you don't face the gender stereotyping just because you're a woman or relatively young, you won't go into academia. No, that's not the case anymore. But unfortunately for many other women in other professions, as I mentioned half jokingly, that the Global Gender Gap Report shows that Korea is ranked 102nd in the world, and that's largely driven first by the gender wage gap. Women make only 60% of what men make in Korea, and women's political empowerment is so much less than men. So, and one of the most important indicators they look at is the women in the National Assembly or Parliament. It's only about 17%, and it's much lower than Northern European countries, lower than the U.S. and so on. So these really pull women down. So so the gender stereotypes have improved in certain segments, certain professions, but it is not still widespread. We still see this very rigid gender gap. Oftentimes I tell my students that Ewha is the best place for women to come and to be educated, because they're not expected to play a gendered role. They're supposed to, build, move podiums from this side to the next on heels, without without even thinking about it. I had Yonsei guys who were standing in the back when we were having conferences. Said, "Should we be going out and helping with the girls?" And I said, "Oh, don't bother. They'll just do it on their own." So at Ewha, we educate and train so they don't have to worry about their proper gender role. And I think it's very powerful in a society where the gender gap is still very high. So it's still very true. It has improved, but still a long ways to go.
Great. Questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. You've mentioned that international students, particularly if they're women, struggle to find jobs in their chosen careers after they return home. So my question is, what role can an institution like Brown play in helping to create these sorts of roles in more STEM-heavy or technology-heavy careers outside of the developed world?
I couldn't get part of the question.
A little bit louder, it's a bit hard to hear.
What role can an institution like Brown play in creating roles in fields like STEM and technology in places outside of the developed world, where international students can return to their home countries and be able to put their skills to use?
That's a very good question, but very difficult to do on an individual basis, I think, because when we're talking about building institutions of higher education in developing countries, one person can't do that. It has to be government to government, international organizations. But first of all, I feel that I have to raise awareness that this is important, because when I talk to international organizations and global audiences, they think primarily in poverty alleviation and protection in developing countries. So when we think about developing countries, all the poverty-stricken faces that you see on these poor ads, you feel like at least you have to put food in there, and provide for their primary education, because many countries or some people in some countries do not even have access to primary education. I don't disagree with that. But if we only stop at providing for primary education or even secondary education without thinking about higher education, I mean, think about yourselves when you just had a primary education or a secondary education. Would that be enough to run a country, run a factory, to build a nation? It's really difficult. You do need more education experience and training. And if we have that capacity only in the global north, it means the students from the global south will come to the global north to be trained, but they won't have a place to go back to. I mean, even if they really desire to go back to their home in the global south, if there are no jobs, if there are no good jobs or institutions to use their talent, it's very difficult to make that choice to go back, to do everything from, scratch. So I say, if international organizations are really, if they really mean they want the world to be a more developed place, they have to also work on providing for higher education through official development assistance, foreign aid, for private companies to donate more in those endeavors in global public goods. We have to do that. It's difficult to do as an individual, but I guess as an individual, if you have research interest in documenting what the problem is, how brain drain is causing greater degradation in developing countries, if you do research like that, even as an individual, I think you can make a difference. And I often feel that I'm bilingual, so I can speak Korean and English, and I can write in both languages. But I felt very critical in writing and publishing in English, because I wanted the people in the United States, the UN, to be able to read without going through the trouble, because they don't like to take the trouble of learning another language more so these days than before. So I felt that if I needed to reach out to the mainstream in the global arena, I have to do it in English. And you're here at Brown, and perhaps the research that you do could help reach that critical core in global governance to help make some positive changes.
And President Kim, you mentioned, we'll get to you in one moment, you mentioned the kind of technological shock that we've had with COVID and changes in education. To what extent do you think some of those technologies, distance learning and work that's no longer geographically so connected, can those technological changes address some of the problems that the last questioner mentioned? Is there hope in a technological solution?
I think so. I mean, that's why in our report we talked about digital transformation that could work for sustainable development. But from the get-go, you have to have an idea that you want to work to make sure that digital transformation can contribute to sustainable development. How can we use STEM technology to advance people's access to better health care and whatnot in developing countries as well? So you can use science and technology, and that's a critical lever in making sustainable development possible. In your first question, there were some other elements that I wanted to address, but unfortunately, when the pandemic hit, every country in the world decided that their own country was top priority. And I understand. Of course I understand, because, if your family is dying, you have to work on your family. But unfortunately, when this was translated at the international level, it meant the discrepancy that we saw between the global north and global south only exacerbated. The global south, if you think about it, they didn't have access to even testing for COVID in the early years, let alone vaccines or treatment. And then to make matters worse, their economies were suffering more than many of us in the developed world. Many developing countries are heavily dependent on trade, tourism, and it's okay if Providence, you're not so dependent on tourism. But if you're in the middle of whatever country that you want to think about with beautiful natural scenes, these countries are heavily dependent on tourism. And tourism just nearly stopped. So the pandemic had effects in the global south more than we can think of. And it's not just the short term that would be that will return to normal when the pandemic is over, like the gender divide, the poverty issue. Once you fall into the extreme poverty category, it's really difficult to climb out of that. The children who are victims of this, they would not have had the proper education they would need at schools and so on. So I'm just going on, but I'm concerned that the short term is not going to be a short term.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question here.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Stella. I had a question about the way that the SDG plans to allocate, funds or whatever means that they're able to get towards the 17 goals. Because, when I saw your put the picture of it, I remember that I recently downloaded I think it's an app that sort of allows you to get money to donate into specific goals. And I was sort of when I was picking which goals I wanted to sort of give my money to, I was really thinking about what organizations already exist to help these issues. And so with limited global governance, how does how do you intend to sort of distribute funds to each goal to be able to better each goal?
That's a great question, but it goes back to the issue when the United Nations worked on the Sustainable Development Goals. big sort of assumption was, please don't divide the goals, please don't cherry pick, please integrate. So, because some of these goals, there are 17 goals, and we did one of the exercises in our book was to look at the interaction between the 17 goals against each other. Some goals are could have very negative consequences on the other. For example, if you work on zero hunger on number 2, it means to put food on your table, to have more agricultural production. On the other hand, it could mean that you have to use more chemical fertilizer, or it may mean food waste in some countries, and so on. And then it goes to the environmental issues. So it's really important not to pick goals, but to try to see how they're interconnected and how to enhance sustainable development, not at the expense of some goals. So my answer would be, like, try to pick all 17, but still there would be some vulnerable groups or topics that are significant to you, and then you find an international organization or NGO, international NGO, that have a particular focus and support their efforts. I think that's what we can do if you're not working inside these global, institutions. But I think that's the way to start. Yeah, but it's great because it goes back to your original question about do we do collective action or do individual? I think it has to be both, and it's very good that you think about these things and how we can make a difference. We will all make a difference.
Great. Thank you. There's a question in the back. Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So going back to what you said about higher education, so I'm also an international student from Germany, and talking to a lot of other international students here at Brown, a lot of us, even coming from a country like Germany, don't exactly see a future in going back to our country because we're in a very English-based environment, and most of academia is very English-based. And that's also something I learned in my sociology class this semester, that there's almost a bit of like gatekeeping happening in academia because a lot of it is published in English and done in English-speaking spheres. So it's really difficult even for me to go back to a country that has a really like big arena of like academia to do that in English when I have my time here at Brown is everything's in English, and you work between South Korea and the US, and I wanted to know like what's your opinion about like academia being like primarily in English and a lot of big academic journals and papers being in English, and can we change that, and like how can we potentially change that to like help the global South, because I guess it's very difficult for people to try to do research in the global South if it's not in English and if like it's not connected to big institutions in the US or the UK.
Yeah. That's a great question. Also, so my $1 million solution is you have to do both. So at the one hand, we really want to have linguistic diversity in academic publications, other key areas, so that our own languages from our mother tongue are respected, and but on the other hand, recognizing the short term that English is still most wanted in these circles. So it's on a long-term basis, I would encourage you to work to establish more German-based in academic journals and so on. But in the short term, I feel that I have to recognize it's English that's the lingua franca, which is such an ironic to say lingua franca, and it's not French. That is lingua franca. So out of necessity, we do have to work on English. But, from Germany, I know that many German institutions are now using English more so than some of the other European countries, the Netherlands, and then they're much further ahead. So you would try to encourage. In Korea, we don't, Korean is our meta language for teaching, but many of Korea's leading universities decided to have international studies programs that are taught completely in English. So I lucked out when I was getting back, because after having spent about 20 years in the United States as a young adult, and my first job in the United States, it was, although this is not my mother tongue, English is not my mother tongue, it's my second tongue, or my aunt tongue. My aunt is American. But if I were to go back to Korea in '97 and to teach in Korean in undergrad and graduate levels, it would have been difficult. It would have required a little more learning, learning back my mother tongue, but in a more advanced academic way. So I lucked out in finding that little niche that allowed me to continue to use English. So it's not a good answer, I know, but probably a more realistic answer. And I would encourage to work in the German higher education institutions to open up more. I know that German institutions great, but if you look at the women academics in Germany's major universities, they're still far behind. So there are things that you need to chip away and work with other people.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
So, that's very interesting to hear, because me and a lot of other international students, even here, being a Brown, already come from very international backgrounds, going to an international school, like I did myself, and studying in English their entire life, and then going to primarily an English-based institution. So I guess my question is, how can we integrate more English, kind of like what you said in Korea, for people who don't get the access to go to an international school and then go from an international school into a major English-speaking university? And I guess that also has to do with gender equality, because how can we give more women that don't have the opportunity to be exposed to an English-based environment for academia and in STEM, the opportunity to speak English or to be exposed to English-speaking academia within a country rather than having to go to US or UK, if that makes sense.
That's a great question, but I don't know if I can give you any solutions right off the bat. At Ewha right now, about 80% of our courses are taught in Korean. So when international students want to come to Ewha, they have to have those students who go into 80% of the disciplines have to have Korean proficiency at above a certain level. But the other can go into English fields, and of course they have to have English proficiency. So I guess if you work in higher education institutions, you can work on this mix and try to expose your students to more of the global language, which has become English. And I find that even though our courses are only about 20% English, when I do meet with students, many of them have pretty good English skills, unlike when I was growing up, when very few people, my peers, could speak English. So I think with SNS, internet, BTS all over the world, the access to English has become a lot easier. So it's a bit more doable these days. But I'm not sure if I can really answer your question.
It's a hard question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any final questions? Maybe I'll just end with one last one. President Kim, you've exercised leadership in so many different sectors, in the academic sector, in multilateral agencies, in public sector. So if you're giving advice to somebody who's an undergraduate today or is a graduate student, what do you think are the key skills somebody should try to grab now while they're in college or in postgraduate education? What are the key things you think they should be trying to learn, or tools that they should be developing?
That's a great question. I often think about that because I didn't, if I told you what I had or didn't have when I was 19 or 20, or when I was coming to the United States at 22, it was probably impossible if I was a rational person thinking about, I just graduated from Ewha, had no, financial means. My father said no more for education. So, and at the time, it was costly to go into graduate school in Korea.
Yeah.
In the United States, they still provide a scholarship. So, so the biggest, I think, most important lesson that I would like to, talk to you is dream big. Don't look at your environment. Don't look at your circumstances and, tailor your dream because, I don't have the means. My parents are not as rich, or I don't have a, really strong IQ or whatever. Think what you have, but I really want you to think big and not let your dream be confined because of your means. I think so dream big and high, and that's my advice. The second advice is really be prepared. Once you have that dream, I'm this, extra optimistic person that my colleagues, I really don't like that because I think...
That doesn't sound like such a bad characteristic.
No, but if you have to work with somebody like me, you have to say, like, if I see 1% of possibility, I say, great, it means that you can do it. And they're like, it's 1% out of 100. Is that, well, it's 0 or no, it's 0, it's yes. And it drives people crazy. But having that optimism, I think is good. And then to try to find that one way to get there, in spite of your circumstance, I think would really help. But finally, I would say if you have adversity in your lives, nobody wants adversity, nobody wants hardship, but when it happens, think that someone somewhere is training you. Some of you work out at the gym and you have a personal trainer who doesn't let go if you say, oh, it hurts. And they say, use that muscle more. You need to build a stronger muscle. So when adversity comes your way, don't shy away. Don't try to, turn away from adversity, but use it as an opportunity to learn and grow. And if it happens, it happens. Things happen. But I really hope that when it happens, if it's really bad, think, oh my God, somebody's trying to make me really big, and that's why I have this really strong muscle building exercise. And take it in stride. And, years later, you will see that experience of adversity or hardship has really made you a stronger person, a better person. So that's my advice.
Well, on that inspiring note, please join me in thanking President Eun Mee Kim.
Thank you.